A United States Army Special Forces major walked into a joint briefing room at Nha Trang in the spring of 1964 and looked across the table at an Australian captain he had never met, a man barely past 30 who had spent the last 8 months alone in the mountains of Darlak province. And he said something that would be repeated in private and in something close to disbelief by every Australian advisor in country who heard about it afterward. He said, "I don't know what you people think you're doing up there, but it's not an advisory program, it's a circus." The Australian captain said nothing. He picked up his coffee. He let the silence stretch out long enough to become uncomfortable. And then he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a casualty report. The major read it. He read it again. Then he looked up at the Australian and asked very quietly how many men the captain had been working with. The answer was 1,200. The follow-up question was how long it had taken to build that force. The answer was 10 months. The third question, and this was the one that changed everything, the one that traveled from Nha Trang all the way to the desk of General Paul Harkins at May CV headquarters in Saigon within 72 hours, was this: how in God's name did you do it? Wait, what? A single Australian captain, operating largely alone in the Central Highlands, funded through CIA channels, speaking the language of a people the United States military had barely catalogued, had raised and trained, and led a guerrilla army of 1,200 Montagnard tribesmen that American Special Forces teams with full battalion-level assets and years of institutional resources in the region had not come close to replicating at that scale. And the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, the most elite and culturally sophisticated unconventional warfare unit in the American military inventory, genuinely had no idea it was happening until the results were already staring them in the face. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what happened in the months and years after that briefing room confrontation, the classified reports that circulated, the professional resentment that festered, the institutional admissions buried in memoranda that nobody wanted to write, the moment when American advisors working alongside Australian training team members in the field stopped arguing about methodology and simply started watching. None of it would have happened if anyone in the American advisory chain had paused long enough to ask a single serious question about what the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam actually was. Not what it looked like on paper, what it actually was, and why the Australians who composed it, almost to a man, had spent their careers learning things about jungle warfare and counterinsurgency that American military training in the early 1960s had not even identified as subjects worth teaching. By the end of this, you will understand why a force of never more than 227 men, smaller than a single American company, became the most decorated Australian unit of the entire Vietnam War. You will understand why captured Viet Cong documents spoke about Australian advisors differently from the way they spoke about Americans, and you will understand why, decades later, when American military colleges tried to write the definitive account of what went right and wrong in Vietnam, the Australian training team kept appearing in the footnotes of chapters the Americans would have preferred to write about themselves. Stay with me. The thing about the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam that no American briefing document adequately explained was that it was not simply a collection of advisors sent to do what American advisors were already doing, but better. It was something structurally different from the ground up, built out of a philosophy of war that had been forged in conditions Americans had not experienced, carried by men whose average age was 35 and whose professional lives had already included combat tours that most American soldiers would not see in an entire career. To understand why the team functioned the way it did, you have to go back further than Vietnam. You have to go back to a jungle 1,100 kilometers southwest of Saigon, where the British Commonwealth learned, at considerable cost in blood and patience, what it actually meant to defeat a communist insurgency. The Malayan emergency ran from 1948 to 1960. The British Army, alongside Australian and New Zealand units, spent 12 years dismantling the Malayan Communist Party's armed wing, the Malayan Races Liberation Army, through a campaign that has since become the canonical example of successful counterinsurgency in the 20th century. It was not won through body counts. It was not won through firepower ratios or sweep and clear operations or strategic bombing of jungle canopy. It was won through patience, cultural understanding, small unit operations conducted by soldiers who had learned to move through jungle as the jungle's inhabitants moved, and through an advisory relationship with local forces that was built on personal trust accumulated over months and years rather than on organizational charts and rotation schedules. The Australian soldiers who served in Malaya came home understanding that insurgency was a political problem with a military dimension, not the other way around. They understood that the people living in contested territory were not an obstacle to military operations. They were the terrain. When the Australian government announced on the 24th of May 1962 that it would deploy up to 30 officers and warrant officers to South Vietnam as military advisors, the men selected for what would become the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam were not chosen from a general pool of available soldiers. They were hand-picked, career officers and senior non-commissioned officers, the majority drawn from infantry, SAS, and commando backgrounds, most of them with Malayan emergency experience, and some with Borneo service as well, every one of them considered an expert in what the Australian Army called counter-revolutionary warfare. The average age of the initial contingent was 35. These were not young men learning their trade. These were professionals at the peak of their craft, sent to do a specific job because they were the most qualified people in the Australian Army to do it. Colonel Ted Sarong arrived in Saigon on the 31st of July 1962 to command the team. Sarong was an unusual figure even by the standards of a unit that attracted unusual figures. He had spent years studying insurgency not as an abstract military problem, but as a living system, had instructed the Burmese army in jungle warfare in the late 1950s, had developed theories about counterinsurgency that were at least a decade ahead of what American military doctrine was beginning to grapple with. When Sarong arrived in Vietnam, he was simultaneously appointed senior advisor on counterinsurgency to the commander of United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which meant he was advising the most powerful military command structure in the country while also running a 30-man advisory unit whose actual daily operations put his theories into practice from the moment the first team members stepped off their aircraft. The 15 officers and 15 senior NCOs who composed the initial AATTV contingent dispersed across South Vietnam almost immediately, embedded individually or in pairs into South Vietnamese Army units, into Special Forces camps, into remote outposts in provinces that American advisors rarely visited. They operated within the already established American advisory framework, technically under the auspices of the Military Assistance Advisory Group and later MACV, but they operated in a manner that was distinctly their own. They were not training South Vietnamese soldiers to fight like Americans. They were teaching them jungle craft, small unit tactics, night operations, and patrolling techniques developed through actual experience in actual jungle against actual insurgents. The distinction mattered more than any organizational diagram could convey. By September 1964, the team had grown to 73 members. By June 1965, it had reached 112. At its peak in November 1970, it numbered 217. But even at its largest, the AATTV was tiny by the standards of American military commitment in Vietnam, where by mid-1969 the United States had more than 500,000 troops in country. The team was never a mass force. It was something more dangerous than a mass force. It was a collection of individually irreplaceable experts scattered across the length and breadth of South Vietnam, each one operating in conditions of isolation and complexity that would have broken most soldiers who had not been selected and trained specifically to thrive in exactly those conditions. To understand the specific friction that developed between the AATTV and their American counterparts, you have to understand what the American advisory effort looked like in 1962 and 1963, before the mass deployment of combat troops changed the character of the war entirely. American advisors at that period were typically officers and NCOs attached to South Vietnamese Army units on 12-month rotations, tasked with the immediate tactical improvement of the units they advised. Their training was oriented toward the American way of war: firepower, logistics, organization, the application of conventional military force to measurable tactical problems. Most of them were professional, dedicated, and genuinely committed to their mission. Most of them also arrived in Vietnam with very little preparation for the specific cultural and operational environment they were entering, and very little institutional framework for the kind of relationship building over extended time that effective advisory work actually required. American Special Forces were different in theory. The Green Berets had been created specifically for unconventional warfare, civil affairs, and foreign internal defense. They were supposed to be the Americans who could do what Australian advisors did: embed in local communities, learn local languages, build trust over time, develop indigenous forces that could sustain themselves without constant external support. In the early 1960s, many of them were attempting exactly that in the Central Highlands and along the borders, working with the Montagnard tribal peoples through the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program, which had begun as a CIA initiative in 1961 and been transferred to military control in 1963. The CIDG program had real successes: American A-teams living among Montagnard villages, training and arming strike forces, running village defense networks. This was exactly the kind of population-centric counterinsurgency that the theory of the time prescribed. But it also had systematic problems that the institutional culture of the American military made difficult to address. Rotation schedules disrupted relationships. The pressure to demonstrate measurable progress created incentives to inflate numbers and minimize complications. The language barrier between English-speaking advisors and Montagnard tribespeople, who often spoke neither Vietnamese nor English, was a constant obstacle, and the relationship between American Special Forces and South Vietnamese Army commanders, who deeply distrusted Montagnard autonomy and resented the armed tribal forces that American advisors were helping to build, was a source of constant friction that undermined the program from above, even when individual A-teams were doing genuinely effective work. Into this environment, in 1963, walked Captain Barry Peterson. Peterson was 28 years old when he arrived in Vietnam. He had already served in the Malayan emergency and carried in his working memory the practical knowledge of what it looked like when an indigenous force actually trusted the man training them enough to follow him into combat. The CIA, which was running the covert operational side of the Montagnard program in the Central Highlands, had specifically requested Australian advisors, had sought, in the words of one account of the period, to tap into Australian knowledge of counterinsurgency that American personnel could not replicate simply through formal training courses. Peterson was attached to the CIA's Covert Action Branch and sent to Darlak Province, to the regional capital of Ban Mae Thuot, which sat in the middle of Montagnard territory in the Central Highlands, a landscape of forested ridgelines and river valleys that had been Viet Cong operating ground since before most American advisors knew the name. What Peterson did in Darlak Province over the next 2 years was, in the most literal sense possible, a demonstration of the difference between Australian advisory doctrine and what much of the American advisory effort produced. He did not arrive with a training schedule and a weapons manifest. He arrived and began to learn. He spent the early months of his deployment building relationships with the Raid people, the dominant ethnic group in the area, before he asked them for anything military. He learned to communicate in their language directly, rather than through translators whose presence created distance and introduced error. He adopted their customs and their manner of dress. He ate what they ate. He went where they went. He sat with village elders in the evenings, not to extract intelligence, but simply to be present, to be known, to become part of the social fabric of the communities he was working in. This was not sentiment. It was methodology, and it was methodology that the Australian Army had developed through the Malayan emergency, where the lesson had been learned in blood that no military advisor could effectively train or lead men who did not trust him, and that trust among the Montagnard peoples was not extended to outsiders on the basis of rank or institutional authority. It was extended on the basis of personal character demonstrated over time. Peterson understood this because his training and experience had prepared him for exactly this reality. Most American advisors understood it in theory, when the training manual said it, but the rotation schedule and the metrics pressure made it institutionally difficult to practice. Within 12 months, Peterson had recruited and was training what would become the Truong Sun Force, the force that would be known and feared and respected throughout the Central Highlands as the Tiger Men. The CIA supplied funding, weapons, and equipment, and Peterson applied the money with what one account describes as straightforward practicality. He paid volunteers, refused to use coercion, and turned away men who seemed to be there for reasons other than actual commitment. Within 2 years, the Truong Sun Force had grown to 1,200 men. It was operating against Viet Cong supply routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, running intelligence networks, conducting ambushes, rescuing Montagnard people who had been taken for forced labor by communist forces. The Viet Cong placed a price on Peterson's head. They called him by the name the Raid gave him, Dam Sam, after a legendary warrior of their own tradition who had never been defeated in battle. The force Peterson built was not a body count machine. It was a community defense network that operated on the basis of genuine loyalty between soldiers and their commander, genuine knowledge of the terrain and the enemy, and genuine investment in the protection of the villages the force was drawn from. When the Montagnard Revolt of late 1964 threatened to boil over into open conflict with South Vietnamese government forces, a revolt driven by the accumulated resentments of tribal peoples who had been marginalized and exploited by Saigon for years, Peterson intervened personally. He talked to his men. He convinced them to stay out of a confrontation that would have resulted in South Vietnamese military retaliation and the destruction of everything the program had built. An American advisor was unlikely to have had the standing in the eyes of those men to make that argument succeed. Peterson had it because he had earned it by being present in the way his training and his instinct had taught him to be present. The reaction from some quarters of the American intelligence establishment was not entirely congratulatory. When results are so dramatic that they make the surrounding institutional environment look bad by comparison, success becomes its own political problem. Peterson's CIA handlers began to worry about what they described as a personality cult, the degree to which the Truong Sun Force's loyalty ran to Peterson personally rather than to any organizational structure above him. When the CIA began pressing him to redirect the Tiger Men into the Phoenix program's assassination operations, Peterson refused. His men were volunteers. They had signed up to defend their villages, not to become instruments of targeted political killing. The refusal cost him the support of elements of the American intelligence community, and eventually, he learned years afterward, his life had apparently been in jeopardy from people within the system who wanted him removed. He made it out of the highlands alive when his tour ended in 1965. The Truong Sun Force he left behind would not survive the full weight of what the war became after Australian forces withdrew. Peterson's story was the most dramatic expression of what the AATTV represented, but it was not an isolated case. Across South Vietnam, in provinces from the demilitarized zone in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south, individual members of the team were producing results through methods that American advisors either could not replicate or were not positioned to attempt. The pattern was consistent enough that it began to register in American institutional consciousness, not always with admiration, and not always without the defensiveness that any large organization feels when a smaller one demonstrates superior results in a domain the larger organization considers its specialty. The friction was partly doctrinal. American advisory doctrine in the early and middle period of the war was built around the measurable improvement of South Vietnamese Army units' conventional combat capability. Body counts, kill ratios, weapons captured, operations conducted. These were the metrics that moved careers and generated favorable reports up the chain of command. Australian advisory doctrine, shaped by Malayan experience, was oriented toward something harder to measure: the gradual extension of genuine security into previously contested areas, the building of local forces capable of sustaining themselves without constant external support, the development of the kind of relationship between the Vietnamese state and its rural population that made political loyalty possible. You could not put that in a weekly statistics report. You could see it over months in whether villagers told you where the Viet Cong were hiding, in whether the trail networks through a district started going quiet, in whether the markets in small towns started staying open past dark. Colonel Sarong, who operated at the strategic level of the American advisory effort, as well as commanding the team, was pushing this argument at the highest levels as early as 1962. In a classified assessment he wrote that year, he identified what he called the fundamental problem of the American approach. It was trying to build a conventional military response to what was primarily a political and social challenge. The counterinsurgency, in his analysis, could only be won by building the kind of security that made ordinary Vietnamese people choose the government side over the communist side. not because of American firepower positioned near their villages, but because the government was actually delivering them a better life and protecting them from retaliation. Strategic hamlets, in theory, were supposed to do this. In practice, Sarong told the American National Security Council in May 1963 the program was being expanded far faster than it could be consolidated, leaving gaps in the security net that the Viet Cong moved through at will. He received what one account describes as a violent challenge from Marine General Victor Krulak, who was not interested in an Australian colonel telling the American military establishment that its flagship counterinsurgency initiative was failing. The institutional problem was not that American advisers lacked intelligence or commitment. It was that the American military had not had the experience that taught the lessons the Australians had already learned. The Malayan emergency gave Australian officers a decade of practical education in how insurgencies actually functioned, what made them durable, what conditions caused them to collapse, and what the relationship between a military advisory mission and the local population needed to look like in order to produce lasting results. American military institutions, entering Vietnam with a doctrine shaped by European warfare and Korean War conventional combat, were trying to apply lessons from a fundamentally different strategic context. The AATTV members knew this not as an academic observation, but as the lived foundation of their professional practice. By 1965, when American combat troop deployments began transforming the character of the war, the context in which the AATTV operated changed significantly. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers shifted the weight of the military campaign decisively toward conventional operations, the large unit sweeps, the search and destroy missions, the air assault operations that defined what most of the world came to think of when it thought about Vietnam. The AATTV continued its advisory work, continued operating as individuals and pairs embedded in Vietnamese units across the country, but the institutional relationship between the team and its American counterparts became more complicated as the scale of the American military presence grew and the pressure to conform to American operational priorities intensified. The Australians did not conform. This was not a gesture of defiance for its own sake. It was a practical judgment that their methods produced better results in the specific operational environment they were operating in, and that abandoning those methods in order to mirror American procedures would make them less effective rather than more effective. AATTV members working alongside American Special Forces teams in the CIDG program and the Mike 4 structure, the mobile strike units composed of CIDG personnel and led by American and Australian advisors, found that the Australians and Americans sometimes reached very different conclusions about the same tactical situations. American teams tended to call in fire support earlier and more heavily. Australians tended to hold fire, maneuver quietly, exploit the element of surprise more fully before engaging. American teams were inclined to extract after contact. Australians were more likely to stay in place, continue operating, push the intelligence gathered during contact into follow-on operations. These differences were not always welcome. There were moments of genuine professional tension, moments when American advisers questioned Australian judgment openly, and Australian advisers responded in the particular way that Australian professional soldiers responded to professional criticism, with the calm, slightly lethal courtesy of people who have already done the mental calculation and concluded that the argument is not worth having because the evidence will speak for itself in due time. Members of the team learned to operate in the space between the American advisory structure's expectations and their own operational instincts, neither openly defying American preferences nor abandoning what their experience told them was right. It required a particular kind of professional confidence. The team's selection standards, the emphasis on mature, experienced soldiers rather than young men in their first or second years of serious military service, produced exactly that kind of confidence. The team's geographic dispersal across South Vietnam gave the Australian government something the task force concentrated in Buoc Tui province could not provide: a ground-level view of the entire country. AATTV members were operating in I Corps near the DMZ, in the Central Highlands, in the Mekong Delta, in the cities and provincial capitals of the coastal plain. They were reporting back through Australian channels on conditions across the full width and breadth of the war, providing Canberra with an independent assessment of how the conflict was actually going, rather than how American optimism reports said it was going. This intelligence function was never the team's official mission, and it was never discussed openly in the American advisory community, but it was real and it was valued, and it was another expression of the fundamental Australian decision to maintain independent professional judgment within a coalition framework, rather than simply accepting the larger partner's version of events. The AATTV's casualty record tells a particular story about what the work actually meant in human terms. Because of the nature of their deployment, individuals and pairs embedded in Vietnamese units conducting combat operations, far from any Australian support structure, often in the most difficult terrain in the country. Team members were exposed to more consistent personal danger than almost any other Australian personnel in Vietnam. They could not retreat to a large base when operations ended. The base was wherever the Vietnamese unit they were advising was operating. When that unit was ambushed, the Australian advisor was ambushed with them. When that unit conducted a night assault, the Australian advisor was in the assault. When that unit's position was overrun at 3 in the morning, the Australian advisor was in the position. The 4 Victoria Crosses earned by members of the AATTV between 1965 and 1969 were each awarded for acts of extraordinary courage in situations of exactly this kind. Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley died in Quang Nhi Province in November 1965 when, after his patrol was ambushed, and his fellow advisor, Warrant Officer Ronald Swanton, was severely wounded. Wheatley remained with Swanton under direct fire, refused to abandon him, and was killed alongside him. The citation noted that Wheatley's actions showed complete disregard for his own safety in circumstances where withdrawal would have been both possible and justifiable. He was 29 years old. Warrant Officer Rayin Simpson earned his Victoria Cross in May 1969 in Kon Tum Province in the Central Highlands, leading a Mike Force operation against a North Vietnamese Army assault that overran his position at night, conducting what the citation described as a series of courageous acts over several hours that saved the lives of his troops and allowed the surviving elements of his force to withdraw to safety. Simpson was operating essentially alone at several points during the action against forces that outnumbered his element massively, and the conduct the citation describes is less reminiscent of what most people imagine when they picture a military advisor than it is reminiscent of what it actually meant to advise combat forces in Vietnam, which was, in practice, to be a combat soldier who also happened to be teaching the men around him how to fight. Warrant Officer Keith Payne's Victoria Cross, also awarded for actions in May 1969, came from a multi-day operation in which his force of Montagnard troops was overrun by a North Vietnamese Army regiment in the Central Highlands, and Payne spent the better part of a night moving through territory controlled by enemy forces, locating scattered members of his force and leading them back to friendly lines in a running engagement that continued until after daybreak. He accounted personally for several enemy soldiers during the withdrawal and brought back 40 of his men. The unit he was operating with was a CIDG Mobile Strike Force, exactly the kind of indigenous force that the AATTV had been building and leading since the program's earliest days, exactly the kind of unit that the American Major in Nha Trang had dismissed as a circus until he saw the results. The deeper context of that dismissal, and of the dozens of smaller frictions that accumulated over the course of the team's decade in Vietnam, was a story about institutional humility and its absence. Large military organizations are not naturally inclined toward learning from small ones, particularly when the small organization's success implicitly critiques the large one's methods. The United States Army in Vietnam was the most powerful military force in human history trying to solve a problem that scale and firepower could not solve, and the Australians working alongside them kept demonstrating, quietly and persistently, and without making a great deal of noise about it, that the problem could be approached differently. Some Americans heard this. The AATTV's influence on American counterinsurgency thinking was not zero. Sarong's briefings to the National Security Council in 1963, whatever frustration they generated in the short term, planted questions that did not entirely disappear. American Special Forces teams that worked closely with AATTV members over extended periods absorbed methods and perspectives that they would not have developed otherwise. The Jungle Warfare Training Center, established at Nui Dat in 1971, modeled on the Australian facility at Canungra in Queensland and run largely by AATTV personnel, became a real institution where Vietnamese forces learned techniques that Australians had developed through 2 decades of jungle combat experience. At the individual level, American officers who had the intellectual honesty to watch what Australian advisors produced and ask why were sometimes changed by what they saw. But the institutional level was a different matter. American military culture in the Vietnam era measured success in ways that made the Australian advisory approach difficult to credit in official channels. You could not put relationship building in a weekly report. You could not convert community trust into a kill ratio. You could not chart the gradual development of a Montagnard strike force from 0 to 1,200 men on a progress graph that made sense to a general in Saigon who had 30 other things on his desk. The metrics existed to satisfy institutional needs that were not the same as the operational needs on the ground, and the Australian approach, which was fundamentally oriented toward the operational needs on the ground, was therefore always at risk of being evaluated by standards that could not capture what it was actually achieving. This was the core of the problem that the Special Forces Major in Nha Trang encountered when he read Peterson's casualty report and started asking how the Truong Sun Force had been built. The numbers were not difficult to understand. What was difficult to understand was the process that had produced them, because the process was incompatible with the American institutional framework for what an advisory program was supposed to look like. American advisors trained Vietnamese soldiers. Australian advisors did that too, but they also became, in some cases, the kind of figure that the community they were working in had never quite experienced before. A foreigner who had come not to extract something, not to use them as instruments of someone else's war, but to be genuinely present in their situation and to treat their survival and their well-being as the actual operational objective. The Montagnard tribespeople who followed Peterson into the jungle were not following him because they had been told to by a program chart. They were following him because over the course of months he had demonstrated that he was worth following. When the American withdrawal from Vietnam began accelerating after 1969, the AATTV's role shifted toward the function it had first been designed for: training South Vietnamese and regional forces to sustain operations without direct Allied involvement. The mobile advisory and training teams that operated throughout Phuoc Tuy province and beyond during the final years of the commitment were a compressed expression of everything the team had learned over a decade of operation. Small groups of experienced advisors moving through the country, working with territorial forces, regional force and popular force companies, the village-level militia units that were, in the end, the last line of defense when the large Allied formations withdrew. The Jungle Warfare Training Center at Nui Dat, which conducted its first course in February 1971, was in some ways the most explicit legacy the AATTV left in Vietnam, a physical institution where Australian-developed counterinsurgency doctrine could be passed on systematically to Vietnamese forces. The irony was that it came very late in the final years of the Australian commitment, when the political and military situation had already moved past the point where a training institution could change outcomes at the strategic level. The knowledge was being transferred as the context that would allow it to be applied was collapsing around it. The AATTV made its final withdrawal from Vietnam in December 1972. It had been in country for more than a decade, longer than any other Australian unit, longer than most American advisory elements. It had lost 33 members killed and more than 100 wounded. It had earned 4 Victoria Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, and more than 200 other individual decorations. It had operated across virtually every province of South Vietnam, working with ARVN regular units and regional forces and Montagnard strike companies and special forces camps from the demilitarized zone to the Mekong Delta. Its 227 members at peak strength had, by almost any measure available, produced a higher return on investment than any comparable component of the Allied effort in Vietnam. There is a question that hangs over the entire history of the AATTV, as it hangs over the entire history of Australian military involvement in Vietnam, and it is this: did any of it matter in the end? Did the Tiger Men matter? Did Peterson's patient months in Darlac province matter? Did Sarong's arguments in Washington and Saigon matter? Did the quiet professional work of 217 advisors dispersed across a country at war matter? The answer that the history gives is complicated, as it always is when the question is applied to a campaign that was ultimately lost. The Truong Sun Force, after Peterson's departure, was gradually drawn into the broader CIDG framework and then, after 1968, converted into South Vietnamese Army Ranger units as the Americanization and then the Vietnamization of the war transformed the institutional landscape. The Tiger Men's extraordinary unit loyalty to Peterson, to each other, to the communities they had grown from, was precisely the thing that made them difficult to absorb into a conventional army structure. Some of them continued to fight. Some of them did not survive the war's final years. Peterson learned of plots against his life by people within the system who had resented what he built and feared what it represented. He made it home. Not everyone did. But the question of what mattered in the long run is perhaps the wrong question to ask about the AATTV, because what the team produced was not simply tactical results in specific provinces, What the team produced was proof. Proof that an advisory program built on genuine respect for the people being advised, genuine cultural understanding of the operational environment, and genuine professional expertise in counterinsurgency could achieve results that programs built on institutional procedures and rotation schedules and body count metrics could not match. That proof did not change the outcome of the Vietnam War. But it did not disappear either. The Special Forces major who sat across from Barry Peterson in that Unheard briefing room in 1964 and asked, after reading the casualty figures, how in God's name it had been done, that question was the right question. Not how many men, not what weapons, not what American support structures had been involved. How had it been done? The answer was not a doctrine or a manual or a training program. The answer was a philosophy carried in the professional knowledge and personal character of the men who composed the team, forged in the Malayan jungle and refined through years of experience that the American military system had not provided its own people because the American military system had not thought to look for it in the same places. Years after the war ended, after the classified assessments were written and the lessons were supposedly absorbed, and the military colleges began incorporating Vietnam into their curricula, the AATTV kept appearing in the literature of counterinsurgency, not as a curiosity, not as an example of a small Allied contingent doing its modest part, but as an example of what advisory work could achieve when it was built on the right foundations. The foundations were not technological or organizational. They were human. They were the foundation of knowing the people you were working with well enough to earn their trust, and trusting them enough to let them fight their own war on their own terms with your support rather than your command. The American major learned that lesson in a briefing room at Nha Trang when he read a sheet of paper that described 1,200 men willing to go into the jungle and risk their lives for a program that had started with a single Australian captain who showed up in the Central Highlands with no large headquarters, no elaborate logistics chain, and no illusions about what would actually be required to build something real. What would be required was time and patience and the kind of quiet, cumulative professional commitment that does not generate dramatic reports, but does, over months and years, generate the only thing in counterinsurgency that has ever actually mattered: the trust of the people you are trying to help. The Tiger men of Darlak province knew that. The Rud tribesmen who called their leader Dam Sam, the legendary warrior who was never defeated, knew that. The AATTV, from its first 30 members in 1962 to its final withdrawal in 1972, knew that in the bones of its professional character. The major in Nha Trang learned it from a single sheet of paper. It took him the rest of the morning to stop asking questions. By that afternoon, some accounts suggest he had begun making different kinds of requests through his own chain of command. Not orders, requests. Requests for information, for methods, for the kind of knowledge that could not be transferred in a formal briefing, but could sometimes be passed between professionals willing to sit down, set rank aside for a moment, and listen to what the experience of the other man had actually taught him. That is, perhaps, the most that can be said about what the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam left behind in the history of the war. Not a changed outcome, but a changed question. Not victory, but a demonstration that there had been another way to try. The question the major asked that spring morning in Nha Trang, "How in God's name did you do it?" was the question that the entire Allied effort in Vietnam should have been asking, loudly and consistently, and with genuine humility, from the very beginning. The Australians had been answering it, with results rather than words, for 2 years before anyone with enough rank to change something important stopped long enough to actually listen. The team persevered. Their motto, the single word on their badge, persevere, was not chosen for its inspirational resonance. It was chosen because it described exactly what the work required, and exactly what the men who did the work had, and exactly what the institutional culture of their larger American allies found most difficult to practice. In a war defined by the impatience of overwhelming force, the Australian training team was patient. In a war measured by the volume of destruction delivered, the team measured by the depth of the relationships built. In a war that the largest military in human history tried to win by being everywhere at once, and found that it could not be done, a force of never more than 227 men demonstrated, in province after province and jungle camp after jungle camp, that sometimes the only way to be everywhere is to have made yourself part of the place so completely that the place itself fights on your behalf. That is what the Major saw in the casualty report. That is what the question meant. And that is why the story of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, a force most people have never heard of, in a war most people believe they already understand, belongs at the center of any serious account of what was actually at stake in the jungles and highlands of South Vietnam, and what was actually possible, and what was actually lost when the helicopters finally lifted off and left.